Hello, and welcome to my Outlaws at Thunder Junction limited set review. Today I'm going to be talking about the white cards in a limited context only and not in any other set context, so I'm not especially knowledgeable about those. Um, if you haven't been here before, I use these tiers. I use 5 tiers to sort of rate the cards. Feel free to pause and read up on what they do. Essentially, tier 1 is good, tier 5 is bad, and then the other tiers sort of fill in the middle. And I'll be talking about all the cards today: commons, uncommons, rares, beginning with another round. So this is an XX2 and a white for a sorcery. Exile any number of creatures you control, then return them to the battlefield under their owner's control. You repeat the process X more times. This type of effect generally is extremely situational. Having it be a sorcery just sort of makes it even worse. And in limited, it's just too hard to get your board to sort of be in a state where this does anything. You're paying 5 mana to blink one creature one time, and you have to really be getting to 7 mana to do anything reasonable, right? 7 mana is kind of the floor. But just way too difficult to have enough mana to do that. Archangel of Tithes. 1 and 3 white mana for a 3/5 flyer. As long as it's untapped, creatures can't attack you or planeswalkers you control unless their controller pays 1 for each of those creatures. As long as it's attacking, creatures can't block unless their controller pays 1 for each of those creatures. So, essentially what this boils down to is a 4 mana 3/5. How good is a 4 mana 3/5 flyer? It's okay. That's basically what I'm grading this card as. The first ability, essentially, the problem with it is, how many creatures is your opponent realistically going to be wanting to attack into a 3/5 flyer anyway? And the answer is not anything, not many. Only their really big stuff. And they're probably okay with paying 1 for, their biggest creature to attack, which is probably what they were going to do anyway. So I don't really know how good that first ability actually is in the average game state. There's also the mercenaries tokens, which allow you to sort of redistribute your power onto one creature. You could just tap them and then sort of essentially redistribute their power to one of your more important creatures and attack with just that one. So I don't know, I'm not a huge fan of that first ability. The second ability I do think is good, because it sort of makes all your creatures pseudo unblockable. It makes it very difficult for your opponent to block. Yes, they can leave up exactly 1 mana, and then you can't necessarily just attack all, but then you're you know what I mean? It does make it hard for your opponents to block, but the triple pip is bad. It's hard to cast. This card I've just put in basically average, tier 3. I think it could even be worse than this. The reason I put it this high is because it is just sort of a 4 mana 3/5 flyer in a heavy white deck, and that's okay. It's a 4 mana 3/5 flyer with some upside that the upside is maybe not super amazing, but it blocks pretty well and isn't a complete disaster. But again, you do need to be able to cast the card, and it's not super impactful. So I wouldn't be pack 1 pick 1ing this very often. I don't think. I think that seems unwise to me. Armored Armadillo, single white mana for an 0/4 with ward 1. It also has 3 and a white. It gets plus X plus O until end of turn, where X is its toughness. So we've seen these sort of 1 mana 0 toughness creatures before, 0 power creatures before with high toughness. Now 4 is higher than usually. Usually it's an 0/3. And 4 can block stuff early. The problem is that it's just never you're never gonna want to be paying. You're gonna have other things to do with your mana, right? 4 mana to make this a 4/4 is just not great. And then if you have 8 mana to make it an 8/4, it's how were you not spending your 8 mana doing something else? And the ward 1 kind of doesn't matter because your opponent doesn't really ever want to kill this. So I'm not a big fan of this. I don't think I'm gonna be playing much of it. Aven Interrupter. 1 white for a 2/2 with flash and flying. When it enters the battlefield, exile target spell, it becomes plotted. Spells your opponents cast from graveyards or exile cost 2 more to cast. So this is a nice little disruptive piece, right? You counter their 3-drop, and then, or not counter, but you delay their 3-drop by a turn, which is good, and then they like can't cast it from exile. Well, they can cast it, but it costs 2 to cast until they kill this thing. Like it's just a pretty good disruptive card. It is double pipped, and as a result, I have bumped it from tier 1 down to tier 2. Double pipped in limited is kind of a disaster. Like you kind of really like it limits your ability to cast this card on curve, and this card not being on curve makes it a lot worse. So that's something to keep in mind. But I think overall, it's a strong card. Bounding Felidar. 5 and a white for a 4/7. It is a mount, which is relevant. When it attacks, while saddled, put a +1/+1 counter on each other creature you control. You gain 1 life for each of those creatures, and it has saddle 2. So obviously that attack trigger is excellent. But the problem is that this is a 6 mana card that has essentially no immediate impact. Yeah, it blocks pretty well, but I don't know. It's not like there's a couple of good black removal spells. This gets hit by even the one that doesn't target Outlaws, which is kind of terrible because that card, I mean that card's going to be good against white decks just regardless, just generally. But this thing is just kind of just asking to get removed, and also like you can pseudo remove it by just removing their other creatures too. Like you need to have other creatures, and then you need to actually saddle it, which means you're not attacking with one of those creatures, and then it's like it's just got a lot of elements that aren't very good. It is large, like it is going to be able to probably block on turn 6, but that's just, we aspire for more. You know what I mean? I'm aspiring for more out of my 6-drop. Bovine Intervention. 1 and a white for an instant. Destroy target artifact or creature. Its controller creates a 2/2 white ox creature token. These cards are bad in limited. If you are a commander player, do not put this in your deck in limited. It is not good. We know this. So I'm not going to really spend too much time on it. The art's great, though. Bridled Bighorn. 3 and white for a 3/4 with Vigilance. When it attacks while saddled, create a 1/1 white sheep creature token. It has saddle 2. So it's a mount, obviously. The mounts all have saddle. So, this card's interesting. I've put it in tier 4 here, you can see, because its stats are very poor, right? It's a 4 mana 3/4 Vigilance, which isn't super great, and then it has to attack to get the thing, and then you're like, to make a 1/1 with this, you have to tap something that has at least 2 power, which means you're not attacking with it. And this has to have a good attack, which just strikes me as like not super likely to happen. I don't know. This is one that like I could see moving up a little bit, but it just feels like it's a 4 mana spell. Surely there's better stuff to do with 4 mana than play this. Like I think you could play it in a deck, but its value above replacement is extremely low as a result of costing 4. Claim Jumper. 2 and a white for a 3/3 with Vigilance. When it enters the battlefield, if an opponent controls more lands than you may search your library for a Plains card and put it onto the battlefield tapped. Then if an opponent controls more lands than you, repeat this process once. If you search your library this way, shuffle. So, if you're, on the draw, you play this on turn 4, you find a land, and then you're ramped, and then you're actually ahead. The cost of being ahead is that you have a 3/3 Vigilance on turn 4 instead of a 4-drop, which it's not really where you want to be, but it does prevent you from getting mana screwed in some senses. Yeah, I mean, this card's really medium. It's not great. These type of effects tend not to be very good and limited. It's just, like, a 3 mana 3/3 Vigilance is fine. Like, it's a fine card, and that's why I put it in tier 3, and it has upside of finding you a land if you, need it. But I think for the most part, this is just very medium and not super exciting. Ariette's Lullaby. 1 and a white for a sorcery. Destroy target tapped creature. You gain 2 life. So there's a lot I like about this card, but there's also a lot I don't like about this card. It is cheap, right? It is a 2 mana white interaction spell that destroys anything that is tapped. You do gain 2 life. That's huge. That's big. That is really important for cards like this in a controlling deck. Obviously, you don't want this in your aggressive decks. You want it in a controlling deck, and like white historically has had a difficult time being controlling in some sets. Usually sets where white is leading into be more of a control color, it tends to perform pretty poorly. Is that maybe the sense that I'm getting with this set? Potentially a little bit. I have some concerns about white in this format, especially coming off the heels of MKM, where there's going to be a natural bias of people to draft white probably a little bit too high as a result of it being so good in that format. I expect it to be perhaps a little bit bad, at least in the early stages of this format. Um, but yeah, back to this card. I do think you're going to play this in your control decks, but I do think there's also enough. There's like some random vigilance in the set. There's like some other like it has to hit you first. It is also only a sorcery. I don't know. I'm not in love with this effect. We'll see how it plays out. Final Showdown, single white mana for an instant that has Spree. So you can add an additional colorless all to have all creatures lose abilities until end of turn. You can add an additional colorless to choose target creature you control that give it indestructible, and you can add 3 and 2 white to destroy all creatures. So this is an instant speed Wrath. It costs 6 mana. A 6 mana Wrath is not very good. It being an instant is nice. It having the upside to be 7 mana and give one of your creatures indestructible, which is probably the only mode you're going to be using. The all creatures lose all abilities mode is just not super relevant usually. Like it's not worth paying the additional 1 for it, or you're really just not going to have the mana to pay for it. You're going to get blown out by this sometimes. Like some percentage of the time, it's going to be like, oh man, my opponent cast a Wrath on my end step, and now I'm just like dead. But I think most of the time this is going to be pretty medium. Deadly Cover Up was good, but that was 5 mana, and also like let you look at your opponent's hand, which is kind of good on a Wrath. But like adding an additional 1 mana to the cost to be an instant, I think is a pretty significant downside. I think it's probably still playable. It's not a card that you want in every deck. You do have to kind of build around it, and I don't think it's really worth building around, so I've put it pretty low here. Fortune Loyal Steed. 2 and a white for a 2/4. It's a mount. When it enters the battlefield, you scry 2. When it attacks while saddled at the end of combat, exile it and up to 1 creature that's saddled at this turn, and return those cards to the battlefield under their owner's control, and it has saddle 1. So essentially this re-triggers all your ETBs, including the scry on this thing. I originally had this a bit lower, but I moved it up. I think it just does enough. A 2/4 is not the easiest thing to block necessarily, like and block and actually profitably deal with. The one problem with it is that if it dies when it's attacking, you don't get the trigger. So that's actually, hold on. No, it's at the end of combat. So you don't get the trigger until the end of combat. So if it dies when it's attacking while saddled, sorry, you don't get to blink your thing, which is kind of a disaster. But I do think just 3 mana 2/4 ETB scry 2. It has some upside to blink your stuff. It is a threat. It can block well. All those things I think move it to be above average, and I think that puts it in tier 2. Frontier Seeker. 1 and a white for 2/1. When it enters the battlefield, look at the top 5 cards of your library. You may reveal a mount or a plains card from among them. Put it into your hand. Put the rest on the bottom of your library in a random order. So we've seen cards similar to this before. We had the Pirate in LCI. It was in blue. I think the Pirate is better than this because that found artifacts and pirates, which are, always cards where this, finding a plains is good, but, in the late game certainly falls off, and I have not been super impressed with mounts, generally. Like, I think that as a type, they, haven't been super, super impressive to me, so I don't know how many of them you're actually going to want in your deck. I don't know how many of them you're actually going to be able to get in your deck, because again, there's sort of that tension. They can saddle themselves because they're creatures, but they also all do need to be saddled to be like their best. This does saddle a bunch of the mounts by being a 2/1. So really the debate with this card was, do I put it in tier 1 or do I put it in tier 2? And I landed on tier 2, which I think is a little bit more of a reasonable place for it to be. It's very likely to be a 2-for-1. It looks at the top 5, but, and hitting your land drops on time is always good, but it is certainly I don't think as high upside as your Pirate from LCI, which did end up being a tier 1 card. Getaway Glamour. Obviously it's another spree card. It's a single white mana for the spree, and then you have to pay an additional colorless. To exile target non-token creature, return to the battlefield under its owner's control at the beginning of the next end step. Or you can pay an additional 2 colorless, or I guess, to destroy target creature if no other creature has greater power. So this is nice. This is a nice removal spell, really a 3-mana remove opponent's biggest creature, usually. It is kind of weird, it doesn't always do that, there's going to be some like weird scenarios. But I think it may play better than it reads because of, it sort of reminds you of the target opponent sacrifices the creature they control with the greatest power. And that effect tends to play pretty well in Limited. We just saw it with the Black Edict in MKM that I don't remember the name of. But essentially you could collect evidence 6 and make them do that. And that card was pretty good when a black's better commons. So I expect this to be pretty good. Just because, it is more expensive than that card, but being an instant is great, and it does have some issues with, like, sometimes you're going to want to kill something that you can't. But I think that is balanced out by getting the ability to be like, oh, I'll just pay 4 and I'll blink my thing that gets value, and that's pretty good. I think that's a pretty good thing to be doing. High Noon. 1 and a white for an enchantment. Each player can't cast more than 1 spell each turn, and you can pay 4 and a red to sacrifice it, and it deals 5 damage to any target. So this card's terrible, like if you think about it as like a, 7 mana to deal 5 to something, is just not, whatever. Again, you can sort of be like, oh, but I'm plotting spells and my opponent's not. Realistically, no, everybody's going to have plot cards in their deck. Like, it's not like you're really getting your opponent by saying, like your opponent's going to have instant speed stuff to do, your opponent's going to have plot too. You having more than them is pretty unlikely, and like, you could have more, but like enough more that you're willing to basically put a card that doesn't do anything into your deck is not where I want to be. Yeah, I don't know. Maybe this will show up in like some constructed sideboard of something. I don't know. You tell me. Holy cow. 2 and a white for a 2/2 with flash and flying. When it enters the battlefield, you gain 2 life and you scry 1. Yeah, it looks pretty good. It is not Inspiring Overseer. Sorry to tell you, it is definitely worse. But it does gain 2 and scry 1, which is good. Like and flash is nice upside, but it's like how close can they make a card to Inspiring Overseer without making Inspiring Overseer? It's pretty close, but it is, I still think, worse than Overseer just as a result of not drawing you the card. Drawing the card is always better than gaining an additional life and scrying, right? So it's like, it's still a good card, it's still going to be playable, it's going to work with all your, synergy stuff, but, at the end of the day, a 3-mana 2/2 flash flyer, it's okay. It's okay. It's just, it's not, amazing or anything. Inventive Wingsmith. 2 and a white for 2/4. At the beginning of your end step, if you haven't cast a spell from your hand this turn, and it doesn't have a flying counter on it, put a flying counter on it. So I was kind of thinking about this, and if you rate the card, like, what would you rate a 3-mana 2/4 flying? Like, if the card just said this is a 3-mana 2/4 with flying, and I would be like, that's probably like a tier 3 card, which I know to some people might be a little shocking. Like, that's an average card. It's like, yeah, the 3-mana 2/4 flyer is not. Like, they printed a 3-mana 2/3 flyer in DMU, and that card was average to maybe even slightly below average. So 2/4 flyer, I think, largely is similar. And this one is just like takes work. Like, I don't, like, why? I don't know. It just seems pretty bad to me. I'm not interested in playing this. Lassoed by the Law. 3 and a white for an enchantment. When it enters the battlefield, exile target non-land permanent an opponent controls until Lassoed by the Law leaves the battlefield. When it enters the battlefield, create a 1/1 red mercenary creature token, and they all have the tap. Target creature you control gets +1/+0. Activate only as a sorcery mode on them. Yeah, this card's just ridiculous. We've seen many of these type of effects before. This is actually, I think, in my opinion, by far the best one. This is better than the one in Brothers War that gave you a Power Stone. This is better than the instant speed one in DMU that gained you 2 life. This is better than the one in the last set that was a sorcery and gained you 2 life. This one hits non-land permanents. They're actually, the only comparable to this would be the Buried in the Garden, right? This is very similar to Buried in the Garden. This one puts something on the board. Buried in the Garden, gives you extra mana. Yeah, this card's just a house. I don't know. It's one of the best uncommons in the set. It's possible it's the best uncommon in the set, better than a lot of the rares. It's very, very good. Mystical Tether, 2 and a white for an enchantment. You may play it as though it had flash if you spend 2 more to cast it. And it enters the battlefield, exile target artifact or creature until it leaves the battlefield. So, Oblivion Ring. We just saw, again, Makeshift Binding. This card is worse than Makeshift Binding because gaining 2 life is better than having the upside of paying 2 to cast it with flash. But still a good card. You're still going to want it in your deck. And, yeah. Nurturing Pixie. Single white mana for a 1/1 flyer. When it enters the battlefield, return up to 1 target non-fairy, non-land permanent you control to its owner's hand. If your permanent was returned this way, put a +1/+1 counter on Nurturing Pixie. So, the fact that this doesn't hit lands is actually pretty bad. There's a decent amount of ETB stuff, but not as much as maybe you would need. This works really well with like the Ox, right? You go turn 3 Ox, turn 4 play this, return the Ox to the hand, and then you get to cast the Ox again. That's okay. I think that's like a fairly reasonable thing that could happen a reasonable amount of the time. There are other ETB creatures in the set. Yeah, so don't think about like a 1-mana 1/1 flyer. We've seen it with no additional upside. We've seen is just not good, like just not good enough. Some people will tell you that it is. Those people are incorrect. Just due to the fact that there's just not enough stuff going on in the set where you care about having a 1/1 flyer on 1 for this to just be good. As a 1-drop, like don't just be playing this on turn 1. You really have to have a deck that wants the thing. But I think in those decks it's going to be fine. Omenport Vigilante. 1 and a white for a 2/2. It has double strike as long as you've committed a crime this turn. So, yeah, I mean, as it says here, it's not going to be easy for white cards to be committing a crime, like just generally. So I think that this perhaps is going to suffer from that. It is an outlaw, which is probably more upside than downside. Double strike's good, and then there's going to be some spots where this card's like insane. But I think the average case kind of looks like, if your opponent blocks, like if you attack this into a 2/2, can your opponent block? And obviously, like, it looks like the answer is no, but I think the answer is probably closer to yes than it is to no. Because, like, again, what are you scared of from a white deck? And the answer is not a whole lot. And then, yeah. It's just, like, early in the game, you can just block this. Like, it's going to be hard to attack with this. You're going to have to just be like, well, maybe I'm okay trading it off. And it's like, well, I don't really want to trade it off. So it's kind of a disaster. But I think it's okay. It's a fine 2-drop. One last job. 2 and a white for the Spree card. So you can pay 2 additional to return target creature card from your graveyard to the battlefield. You can pay 1 additional to return a mount or vehicle card from your graveyard to the battlefield, or you can pay 1 to return or equipment and attach it to a creature you control. Yeah, I like this. So the reanimate effects typically are too expensive. It's weird to see this in white. Usually they give a 5-mana reanimate to black. There is one in black as well. But this being a white card is kind of weird. But I guess it sort of makes sense. I don't know. The card itself is fine, because essentially, like, if you're getting if you have enough mounts in your deck, the thing with this card is you need to have mounts in your deck. You need to want the reanimate. You need to have, like, there's like sort of a concoction of things that you need to have for this to be good. But the flexibility is sort of notable, and I'm noting it. Maybe I'm rating it a little too high. But if you're a slower white deck, which I think white in this format definitely seems like a color that wants to be slower, which I think generally means it's going to be bad. But I think you do probably want to be a little slower. Which I just haven't seen as many aggressive cards like we had in MKM, where it was like, okay, they're gonna give them the best 1-drop ever printed at common, and then we're also gonna give them like one of the best 3-drops ever printed at common. And it's like, okay, so like that leans towards aggression, and this card does not do that. Speaking of cards that don't do that, Outlaw Medic. 1 and a white for a 1/3 with lifelink. When it dies, draw a card. So this is an okay blocker, right? Like, you're going to be able to block with it early, but again, sort of pointing towards white being a slower color. These type of cards tend not to be great. Like, the die's trigger to draw a card is just not very good. It's just really slow, and like, sure, this means that your opponent's not attacking with their 2/2s, but it's not attacking either. Like, the problem with a lot of these type of cards is, like, yes, your opponent is not attacking you, but also you're not attacking your opponent. So, like, nobody is making progress in the game. Like, and you have paid mana to do something that doesn't make the game progress, which generally is bad for you. But I think there's going to be some decks that maybe want this, but I think, again, not super excited. Prairie Dog. 1 and a white for a 2/2 with lifelink. At the beginning of your end step, if you haven't cast a spell from your hand at this turn, put a +1/+1 counter on Prairie Dog, and you can pay 4 and a white, and if you would put a +1/+1 counter on a creature you control, put that many +1/+1 plus an additional +1/+1 counter on it. That ability is not going to come up very much. Just a 2-mana 2/2 lifelink is a good card. It generally would be a tier 3 card, but the additional upside of, on turn 3, plotting a card with this on the battlefield. Obviously, it's at the end step, so you're not getting it immediately. I still think that's enough upside to be happy about, given that, there are decks, like the blue-white deck is supposed to want to not cast spells, although I'm not super excited about that deck. It doesn't spark joy for me. But I think this card's pretty good. It's solid. Prosperity Tycoon. 3 and a white for a 4/2. When it enters the battlefield, you create a 1/1 red mercenary creature token with tap. Target creature you control gets +1/+0 until end of turn. And then you can pay 2 and sacrifice a token, and this card gains indestructible until end of turn. Tap it. Yeah, this card's just excellent, obviously. We've seen many, many versions of this effect. This one has 4 power, which is actually kind of crazy. And this is just big. It's just a big creature that makes another creature. Usually we see 3/3s that do this. This is a 4/2. I think the difference in stat line is somewhat negligible. The effect makes it... The additional, like, sacrifice a token effect is nice, but, and is very annoying to deal with, given that it, like, supports itself. But I think is not something that necessarily you're going to have the mana to do all the time. So, be advised about that. Requisition Raid. So as a sorcery, it's a spree with a cost of single white, and you can add 1 mana to destroy an artifact, add 1 mana to destroy an enchantment, and add 1 mana to put a +1/+1 counter on each creature target player controls. I think there's going to be enough artifact/enchantment stuff running around that this card is probably playable. 2 mana, put +1/+1 counter on each creature target player controls is an atrocious card. Be advised. I kind of want to move this down to tier 4 for that reason, actually. Because, like, when I see this, I'm not actually going to take this, am I? Because I am a noted travel preparations hater. Travel preparations, in my opinion, was one of the most overrated cards ever. And, yes, had some, like, insanely good curve-outs, but most of the time was pretty medium to bad. And I think this card runs into a similar problem of... Yes, if you buff 3 creatures, it's good, but, how often is that actually happening? Less often than you'd think. If this were actually in MKM, I would like it a lot more, because there was more going wide in that set. This set doesn't seem to me to be doing that as much. There are going to be the mercenary tokens. There is, like, red-white that can go a little bit wider. So I think this card could be good there. It's really just a matter of how many artifacts and enchantments are running around, and whether I would put this in tier 3 or 4. I'll leave it in 3, just because I think there might be enough of them to justify running this, but I actually might move it down. I'm not going to draft it this highly. I'm going to start drafting it as if it's tier 4, but I might move it up over time. Rustler Rampage. Single white mana for a spree instant. Untapped all target creatures target player controls, which is a +1. And you can also +1 to give target creature double strike until end of turn. So generally these double strike tricks for 2 mana tend to be terrible, and this one doesn't excite me because, like, the additional untapping mode doesn't really, it just doesn't do it for me. So that yeah. That's all I got to say. Shepherd of the Clouds. 4 and a white for a 4/3 with flying and vigilance. When it enters the battlefield, return target permanent card with mana value 3 or less from your graveyard to your hand. Return that card to the battlefield instead if you control a mount. It doesn't even have to be a mount, it just has to be you controlling a mount. Yeah, this card's obviously excellent. Again, I have some concerns about mounts just generally, but I think this card is so good that it does not matter. It is just a 5-mana, like 4/3 flying vigilance. Vigilance not super relevant on a 3 toughness flyer, but whatever, still good. Would rather have it than not have it. It just draws you a card when it enters the battlefield. 5 mana is the perfect sort of sweet spot for these type of effects because you can trade off on like turn 4. You can like on by turn 4, generally you can make an attack where your opponent's like, well, I guess I want to trade off, and then they block. You get your 3-drop back. It probably comes to your hand. That doesn't really matter. That's fine. I'll live with that. The value this is generating is significant. We're very happy about that. Sheriff of Safe Passage. 2 and a white for a 0/0. It enters the battlefield with a +1/+1 counter on it, plus an additional +1/+1 counter on it for each other creature you control, and you can plot it for 1 and a white. So this is one of a few cards in the set that have a plot cost that is cheaper than their regular cost. Generally, that's a pretty significant upside because you're essentially getting to play the plot card on the same turn as you normally would, but you are paying, like instead of plotting this on 3 and then having to play it on 4, right? You would be plotting this on 2, being able to play it on 3, which is when you would normally be getting this effect, which means it's closer to being on rate, like by plotting it. But yeah, I'm not a huge fan of this card. So essentially, when you think about it, right, you need 2 other creatures for this to be a 3/3. And if this is a 3/3, it's like not good. So you really need 3 other creatures for it to be a 4/4, and then it's like, okay, well then you did it. And like the plot, like the reason this isn't tier 5 is that plot does have some like upside with like not casting spells and being able to spend your mana without casting spells, and like it is cheap-ish, and like double spelling is good. So I could see it having some relevance, but I think this card generally is pretty bad. Stagecoach Security. 4 and a white for a 4/5. It enters the battlefield. Creatures you control get +1/+1 and gain vigilance on Thunder turn, and it has plot for 3 and a white. I really like this card. Now, I only have it in tier 3 because it's a 5-drop, but I mean, this is just a really nice card. Like, this is a card that I'm very happy about being like plotting, and I'm very happy about not plotting, right? On turn 5, you cast this and you didn't plot it on turn 4. That's great. That means your board's bigger. You're going to have a big board. You're buffing your attack. It's going to be great. This is a big thing that can attack after and defend you. It gives all your stuff vigilance too, which is a nice little upside. You can plot it as well. Like if you're one of those decks that cares about that, I think you're not going to be plotting this super often, but when you do, it's nice that you can do that, and it just really seems like a nice glue card that you're going to want in a lot of your decks, but again, not super high priority as a result of being 5 mana. Steer Clear. Single white for an instant. It deals 2 damage to target attacking or blocking creature. It deals 4 damage instead if you control a mount. Yeah, again, the mount stuff, how much, like, mounts are sort of an aggressive mechanic because you have to attack with the saddle to get the trigger. This card is a defensive card. Is there some like conflict there? Yes, I would say that there is some conflict there, and again, why I'm a little concerned about white as a color is like it just kind of seems like I'm not 100% sure if it's all going to be cohesive enough to work, but we shall see. But I think this card's okay. I think it's reasonable. Again, if you already control like a slower deck, this is a card that you can probably play and be not too unhappy about, but certainly not a high priority. Sterling Keykeeper. 1 and a white for a 2/2. It is a mercenary and it has 2, and tap it to tap target non-mountain creature. Yeah, I mean this is fine. I'm not really super happy with the 2-mana 2/2. The Frostbridge Guard in Wilds of Eldraine saw a little bit of play, although I think that was more of a tier 4 card. This card is meaningfully better than that card. for several reasons. One of the reasons is that it doesn't cost white mana to tap, which is significant, and it's a mana cheaper, which is also significant. Yes, the downside of not hitting mounts does matter, but again, I think, you know, you can have a similar effect as tapping down a mount by tapping down your opponent's creature that could saddle the mount during their upkeep, because you can only mount, like you can only saddle as a sorcery. So that is a little like interaction there. Like if you want to tap down your opponent's mount and you can't do that, you can be like, well, the creature they want to saddle the mount with, I can tap that down instead during their upkeep, and then it's harder for them to, saddle it, and then you're sort of accomplishing something similar there. So there are ways to sort of work around that drawback. And it is also an outlaw, which is relevant. Sterling Supplier. 4 and a white for a 3/4 flyer. When it enters the battlefield, put +1/+1 counter on another target creature you control. So we had this exact card in Brothers War, except it only targeted soldiers. Strict upgrade. And that card was great. Like that card in Brothers War was, I think, white's like second or third best common. It was up there. It was a really good card. Really, like one of the things to think about with this is, it sort of what it does is it enables an attack on turn 5, and then it also blocks really well on turn 5, right? So it's really doing both things, which if, and again, white is theoretically a slower archetype. Now, obviously, this can't target itself. I believe the one from Brothers War also couldn't target itself, but I don't 100% remember. I don't think it could target itself. Again, that is downside, but if you're on turn 5 as a white deck and you don't have another creature for this to target, you're in pretty bad shape. Tier 2 is maybe too high. I should probably move. I had it originally in Tier 3. I should move it back down to Tier 3. And I think I'm actually going to do that. Hold on. At the end of the day, it is a 5 drop, and like you just shouldn't prioritize 5 drops that highly, but I do think it's a good 5 drop. Take up the shield. 1 and a white for an instant. Target creature put a +1/+1 counter on target creature. It gains lifelink and indestructible until end of turn. We've seen this before in DMU. It was very, very good. It was white's best common, I believe, in that format. Not that white was super good in that format, but this card was very good, and I expect it to be very good. Again, the deserts coming into play and dealing damage to your opponent means that lifelink is actually better in this set, I think, than it would be even in the average set. I think lifelink is actually going to be very important in this set. So I think this card's very, very good. Thunder Lasso. 2 and a white for a equipment. When it enters the battlefield, attach it to target creature you control. Equipped creature gets +1/+1. Whenever the equipped creature attacks, tap target creature defending player controls, and it is equipped for 2. So, I mean, we've seen this type of card before. The flash equipment that... Oh no, this doesn't even have flash. Oh man, I thought this had flash, and I rated it in Tier 5. Wow, this is a disaster. I actually, like, straight up thought this card had flash, still rated it Tier 5, and was like, this card's terrible. Now that I know it does not have flash, my god, this is horrendous. Yes, I understand that you can tap down your opponent's creature immediately and get +1/+1, but like, what if your opponent ever has like any interaction even one time? The interaction's good in this set. Like, what if they ever interact with the first creature you attach this to? You're just down so much mana. Like, you're down like 3 mana and you have to re-equip. It's just a disaster. Like, it's these sort of cards are just so, like, it just not having flash on this equipment is unexcusable. That is wow, what a disaster. It even has lightning on the equipment. What are we doing? This is it wouldn't have been too good. Right. Trained Arynx. 1 and a white for a 3/1. It is a mount. Whenever it attacks while saddled, it gains first strike until end of turn. Scry 1, and it has saddle for 2. I think this is probably the best common mount, which does not speak especially highly towards the common mounts. Yeah, it's at least the best white one. And if you're doing mount stuff, you need this card. But again, the problem with white is like the mount cards are aggressive. but some of the like mount associated cards are kind of control-ish, and it's like how do you strike that balance? I think that's going to be really tough. I'm not super sold. Vengeful Townsfolk. 2 and a white for a 3/3. When one or more other creatures die, put a +1/+1 counter on it. Oh man, they finally did it. They finally had enough of reprinting Ichorshade for the 8th time and having it still be terrible, and they finally printed a better version of it. So it's a 3 mana 3/3 instead of, Ichorshade was a 3 mana 2/3 in black that had the same effect as this. You would think black would actually be a better color at enabling this. I have bumped it up a full tier from tier 4 to tier 3 as a result of this being more on rate. I do not think it is good still. I don't think it's great anyways. I think it's okay. It certainly gets a lot better by being able to block your opponent's 3-drops even one time over the course of the game, right? Like being a 3/3 instead of being a 2/3 is probably the most significant power boost, right? Going from 2 to 3, just hits such a high range of things. Like even going from 1 to 2, I don't think is as significant as going from 2 to 3 in terms of like having a 3-power creature versus having a 2-power creature. So yeah, I think this is a significant upgrade over that typical effect. That typical effect is pretty bad, so we will see how this plays out. I'm not super excited about it, but I think it's fine. And the final card in white is Wanted Griffin. It's 3 and a white for a 3/2 with flying. When it dies, you create a 1/1 mercenary token. Yeah, no, this is just bad. We've seen these type of effects before. A 4 mana 3/2 flyer is just not good enough, and a dies trigger doesn't really save it. So, yep, not super excited about this one. I think it's playable. Like you can play it, and it's not a complete disaster. But I don't think it's good. It doesn't have any good types. It doesn't like interact with any. It's not like a mount or anything. It just, yeah, just not super exciting. And that's it. That's my review of the white cards. Hopefully you enjoyed, or gained some insight from somebody that has not played with any of the cards yet, about the upcoming format. If you did stick around, there's going to be more of these, and I try to do them every set. So I'll see you next time.